What we've been doing is kind of alternating back and forth between Deuteronomy and last day events. So tonight we'll do Deuteronomy. We're in chapter 4, and we'll start with verse 8, but since it's been quite a while, let me just read a few verses before verse 8. I consider this book one of the most important in the Bible. Jesus quoted more from Deuteronomy than any other book of the Bible. And I consider this text, this passage that we're studying right now, to be the most important text in the Bible, other than, the ones that tell us about Jesus coming to save us. But this one is God's plan for how his people are going to win the world, basically. And of course, it never happened. They didn't do it, but this was the plan, and it's still the plan, I believe. But it's a little different now than it was then. We can start with verse 5. It says, "Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that ye should do so in the land whither ye go to possess it." So Jesus told him how they were to live, and he's just passing it on to them. "Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations." In other words, if you will do what Jesus tells you to do, you will have the same wisdom that he had, and you will look very smart in the eyes of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, "Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people." Now there's been a lot of different ways that people have tried to become great. Today one of the biggest ones is education. People try to become great through education. And it would work if the education was true education. But a lot of it is not true education. And so they don't become great. They may be in front of other people only because true greatness is so rare. And so people look up to those that don't have this. But really, God's plan was very easy, even for those of us with low IQ. Very easy. You read what I told you to do, and you do exactly that. I mean, anybody can do that. And he says, if you do that, people will look at you and say, wow, this is a great nation. They're very wise and they're understanding people. 4, verse 7, we're in Deuteronomy 4. "For what nation is there so great, who hath God so nigh unto them, as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for?" Notice how all the glory goes to God, because they're so wise, doing just what God said, and everybody starts looking at them and saying, they do things the smart way. And of course it gets out. Why do they do it that way? It's because God told them to do it. And so all the glory goes to God. Well, that's just background. We're going to study verse 8 tonight. "And what nation is there so great, that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day?" Now, if you study in the Old Testament, you discover that God's plan was that Israel would fill the whole world. That nation after nation would be faced with the truth that Israel had, and they would either get angry enough to attack them, or they would be interested. If they attacked them, they would lose, and so then Israel would take over their territory, and they would expand into the whole world until everybody was under the rule of God. That was his plan, but of course it didn't work very much. It worked the best in David and Solomon's time, but it never did really work that well because people didn't want to do what we just read. And he still has a problem getting people to do what he said. It's very simple, but it puts us out of step with the world. And most people don't like to be out of step with the world. And so they would rather do what the world's doing than what God said that they should do. In expanding now this verse, we'll start with third spiritual gifts, page 302. These are all comments on this verse. Those nations had laws and regulations to control the actions of the people, which were cruel in the extreme. Now, the United States is a pretty good place, but we do have some laws that are not very nice. And some are being changed. When I think of this, I think of a number of years ago when if a person killed somebody while they were drunk, people said, well, they were drunk, so they're not responsible. Now we have an organization, there's probably several, but the one that I really appreciate is Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. And they've been able to make some changes in those laws. But, you know, God says that when you put the alcohol to your lips, you become responsible for everything you do afterward. That's God's view of it. But man's rules are cruel in a sense because they're too liberal sometimes. Now, on the other side, I see some laws that are cruel from the standpoint of being too harsh. And that has to do with taking children away from their parents for alleged misconduct. And, you know, lots of people have had their children, a neighbor reported something about what they did with their children, or maybe a child calls up the Child Protection Agency and tells them that their parents did such and such. It's not even true, but they will believe the child over the parent. And, you know, so even in this country, we have cruel laws. And we have, in other countries, many cruel laws. So that's the way it was back then. But God wanted to show the people of the world how to have good laws. It says, their laws were made by those whose hearts were not softened by grace. So when people make laws and they're not converted, they make harsh laws. And some people, even in the church, are not converted and they want harsh laws as well. That's just the way it is when we're not converted. And while they would pass over the most debasing crimes, so in some areas they let it go. A small offense would call forth the most cruel punishment from those in authority. So there were laws like that, that there was a very cruel punishment. Moses had this in view when he said to Israel, and then it quotes Deuteronomy 4. So Moses was explaining to the next generation. The book of Moses was given just before they crossed over the Jordan River and just before Moses died. So he was telling them the most important information out of all that God had revealed to him. And so he points out to them, you're blessed. The laws that you have are laws that God himself gave to us. But the other nations, they have some cruel laws and they have some permissive laws, and it's not very nice to live under that rule. But God wants you to demonstrate what it's like to have a wonderful place to live, so that the other nations will say, you know, I think I'll move to Israel because it's a lot better over there. Or why don't we pass laws in our country like they have over there in Israel? That was God's plan for the world to notice that. Another one, commenting on these verses, counsels to teachers, 4:28. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Did he think that was better than what God gave? No, he didn't. And by the way, Egypt at that time that he was there was the United States of that time. And so he still did not consider it better than what God revealed. Where shall we find laws more noble, pure, and just than are exhibited on the statute books, wherein is recorded the instruction given to Moses for the children of Israel? It's a good question. Is there any place we can find better laws than what God gave to his ancient people? No. Now, to our modern society, some of them seem harsh, because we don't really want to stop sin. We just want to tax it. We want to make some money from it. And so some of those penalties look really harsh to us. But in the end, they're merciful because they stop sin. People don't do it. You know, if when you were caught speeding, it was 10 years in jail, would you speed? Would that be considered a harsh treatment? Or would it be considered merciful that we stop the unnecessary deaths from speeding? You see, so we have to look at it through different eyes. And when we really understand God's plan, we can see that his laws were the smart way, the wise way in which to live. Another one, Patriarchs and Prophets 4:65. Says Moses challenged the Hebrew host, and then it quotes from Deuteronomy here. Today, the challenge to Israel might be repeated. So who's the Israel of today? It's us, right? So God is actually repeating the challenge to us. The laws which God gave his ancient people were wiser, better, and more humane than those of the most civilized nations of the earth. Even today, still better. The laws of the nations bear marks of the infirmities and passions of the unrenewed heart. But God's law bears the stamp of the divine. So, in the book of Deuteronomy, of course, the Ten Commandments are repeated in chapter 5. And a lot of other laws are given, which are an expansion of the Ten Commandments that help us to understand specifically what does that mean. For instance, just an example, they had flat houses in general at that time. And there was one statute that you had to put a railing, we would call it, around the top of your house, because if somebody fell off, you were guilty of breaking the commandment, thou shalt not kill. And so you had to put that around. If you didn't do that, you became guilty of that commandment. The commandments are very far-reaching, far wider than what most people realize. And so because of that, God would give at times, he gave many of the specific statements of how you should keep the commandment. And even in the area of dress, you know, If we don't dress like God said, we break the commandment. And it explains that in Deuteronomy and some of the other books there in the Old Testament. Another from Prophets and Kings 3:68 and 9. If, obedient to his requirements, they were to be placed far, not just a little bit, far in advance of other peoples in wisdom and understanding. But this supremacy was to be reached and maintained only in order that through them the purpose of God for all nations of the earth might be fulfilled. Now he placed them very strategically. For the then known world, anytime someone traveled far away, they went through Israel. So they would be exposed to the sacrificial service of Israel. They would be exposed to the laws of the land. And God had a plan that if they would be faithful to all that he said, that this word would go out through all the nations about the wisdom of God. People would start comparing what their country did with what Israel did, and they would be drawn to the God of Israel. Christ Object Lessons, page 290, quotes these verses, and then it says this: those nations that rejected the worship and service of the true God were to be dispossessed. And usually the trigger was when they would try to attack Israel and wipe out Israel. God didn't, they weren't an aggressive nation to go out and conquer everybody. But when others attacked them, then God would pour out his power and they would dispossess them. But it was God's purpose that by the revelation of his character through Israel, men should be drawn unto him. So really, the laws of God reveal his character. When we live by those, it reveals his character. And we reveal it in all kinds of ways. You've probably thought of this, but do our business dealings reveal the character of God? I was just talking with someone today, and there was a lady that came, moved near Wildwood, and started attending our church some of the time. She was, I'm not sure whether she was any religion particularly, but I think she grew up Catholic. And she moved into a house that was owned by an Adventist. And the way she got treated by this Adventist, she quit coming to church. And she's so frustrated with the way this Adventist is treating her that she's actually, when the lease is up, she's moving out. She's fed up with Adventists and with, everything else right now. Now I'm going to go and pay her a visit. I just learned about it today. But I don't know whether I can turn it around. It probably won't be possible to turn it around.
You can lower.
What?
You can lower.
Right. I want her at least to know there's one Adventist that feels differently about it. I mean, I've discussed it a little bit with her. I said, that's not really the right thing to do. But we reveal the character of God in everything we do. Any laws we pass, any rules we have, everything we do, we reveal whether we have the character of Jesus or whether we don't. Yes?
In 1997, we took on a job up in Cleveland.
Mm-hmm.
Without knowing it at first. We bought a house from an Adventist up there and moved into Cleveland, and we found out later that he had had trouble with most of the neighbors. So
Yeah.
we have a job.
Yes. But hopefully you can live it down. It says, to all the world, the gospel invitation was to be given by this method. That's how the gospel was to go to all the world. Just imagine if every Seventh-day Adventist had a high level, I don't expect us to be perfect yet, but if every Seventh-day Adventist had the character of Jesus at a high level, what a testimony this would be to the world. If in all our business dealings and in all the rules that they become aware of that we have and this and that, through the teaching of the sacrificial service, Christ was to be uplifted before the nations, and all who would look unto him should live. So the cross was to be exalted by this same method, and the gospel was to go into all the world, simply doing what God said. All who, like Rahab the Canaanite and Ruth the Moabitess, turned from idolatry to the worship of the true God, were to unite themselves with his chosen people. So this, right at the beginning, was a good example of how it was going to happen. Rahab realized that the God of Israel was a better God to serve than the ones that her city served. As the numbers of Israel increased, they were to enlarge their borders until their kingdom should embrace the world. And why did God want that? God desired to bring all peoples under his merciful rule. He desired that the earth should be filled with joy and peace. He created man for happiness, and he longs to fill human hearts with the peace of heaven. So he wanted to get back as close to Eden as possible, using his people with the simple plan of just doing what God said. That's all. Just practicing what he said, carrying it out in the life, which of course couldn't be done without conversion. And then a person would cherish the laws of heaven. They would practice it, and as a result, they would grow until finally the whole world was under the merciful rule of God. Six Testimonies, page 13, again quoting those verses. Even these words fail of expressing the greatness and the glory of God's purpose to be accomplished through his people. So it's higher than the highest human thought can reach of what God wants to do through us. And I guess the question we have to ask ourselves is, how well are we following what he said? And do we keep studying to find out, is there something that I'm not practicing that he has asked me to do, so that our life can be brought in line? Because the more our life reflects what he asked us to do, then the more powerful our witness can be upon those that we meet throughout, and especially the character that we reveal. It's not just the rule, it's not just the law that we operate by, but it's how we carry it out and what our attitude is and all the rest that goes along with it. And people should be able to see something in Seventh-day Adventists that attracts them to Seventh-day Adventists. Not to this world only, but to the universe are we to make manifest the principles of his kingdom. And then it quotes that verse from the Bible in Ephesians 3:10. To the intent that now unto the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be made known by the church the manifold wisdom of God. So even the other beings, they see how corrupted we have been. And when, through the power of Jesus, we are restored, they learn something about the power of God. We are a stage, in a sense. We're on a stage that is to be seen by the whole universe. All the beings are watching to see, will we cherish what God has asked us to do? Will we see it as wisdom? When he tells us we need to be converted, will we see that we need to have that and accept that? And then all the other instructions that help us to follow the Ten Commandments, will we see the benefit of that? If we do, then we become a great blessing really to the whole universe. And another text that touches on this in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 9, says, "For we are made a spectacle unto the world, and to angels, and to men." Now, I'm sure you've all had some experiences along this line. I was sitting in an airport waiting to go somewhere. I forget where it was now. And I was looking in my computer. I was studying some things. And I didn't realize it, but there was a lady watching me. And just so happened, when we got on the plane, she sat next to me. And she said, "You're a professor, aren't you?" And so I told her I was a Bible teacher. And so then, we talked the rest of the flight. She had just made a decision to get back to God. And so she was eager to talk about these subjects. Well, not that long ago, I had to help my son buy a vehicle because he's made a lot of mistakes in choosing vehicles. So he took my help this time. And we found one. It was a Prius, and it was 2013, which he needed in order to drive for Uber. And so we had to go clear down to Atlanta to a dealer down there. And so we looked the car over, we liked it, and we were finishing up the deal, and the salesman said to me, he said, "You're a pastor, aren't you?" I said, "Well, how did you know that I was a pastor?" So people are reading us when we don't even know that they're reading us. And what God does in our life is talking to people, and how we act toward them, how we treat them, how we handle everything that we handle tells them something. And if it was telling them consistently the right thing, Seventh-day Adventists would turn the world upside down. People would be beating a path to our door, or they'd want to get rid of us. That's the way it goes, one way or the other. But this is God's plan, still his plan today, to do it this way. People don't care a lot about what we preach, to be honest with you. They don't really care that much, because there's all kinds of things preached, and then you look at the person's life and they don't do it. So it's not going to win the world, preaching. But what we are is what is going to win the world. Now, the next verse, which I guess we'll have a little time on that. Someone like to read verse 9 in Deuteronomy 4?
Only take heed to thyself, and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of thy life. But teach them to thy sons and thy sons' sons.
There's a lot in this verse, and we can't finish it tonight, but just briefly, let's look at some key points. It's not talking about keeping your brain diligently, is it? It's the soul. So this text is written from the standpoint of conversion. Heart relationship with Jesus, that's what it's about. And it says your biggest danger is to lose your conversion, to lose your first love, to lose your zeal to follow God and to do what he asked you to do. So you need to really protect yourself on that. And Dennis says, don't forget what God is able to do, because he's done a lot of wonderful things in your past, and you need to remember that. It will help you to stay converted and stay with him. And then, to make it really clear, he said, you need to keep your heart. In other words, when we are converted, that's the most important possession we have, a converted heart. He says, make sure you keep that. Don't let anything rob you of that. And some of the things that can rob us are the pleasures of the world, even just doing too much work for God, to where you don't have time to have a relationship with him. There's just a lot of ways in which we can be robbed of that most important treasure. So he said, make sure you don't lose your heart relationship all your days, and then make sure you teach your children the same thing. Now, some comments on this. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 605. Now, some of you are new. I have a syllabus on this entire commentary on the whole of Deuteronomy. I sent it to the White Estate. Not the White Estate. Yeah, to the White Estate. And they wrote me back a letter, and they said, we didn't know there was so much in Ellen White's writings about the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I've tripled the size of the book since they said that. But they still wouldn't let me sell it in the book and Bible houses. I was hoping, that they would. But if you want one, just let me know. Patriarchs and Prophets, 605, it says, the days of Israel's greatest prosperity had been those in which they acknowledged Jehovah as their king. So even though we can't see a full example of what God had in mind, we can, if we study the history of Israel, see that it did work to some degree. When the laws and the government which he had established were regarded as superior to those of all other nations, that's when it worked. So now, if we were to understand, just take one area of life. If we were to understand that the book Education is a better book to follow than all the universities and all their ideas of education, that the book Education is a better thing to follow than all that, we would be much farther ahead. Just picking out of that one thing. The Bible is to be the chief study book in every true educational school. I've asked students, how many Bible classes did you have in a 4-year degree? And I'm shocked. Some of them tell me none. And some of them tell me 1 or 2. That's all they had. We're not understanding the lesson. But by departing from God's law, the Hebrews had failed to become the people that God desired to make them. And then all the evils which were the result of their own sin and folly, they charged upon the government of God. Isn't that something? So all these troubles that came upon them due to disobedience, lack of conversion, which leads to disobedience, and then they blame God for everything. Now, today, there is that same danger. We blame God when really it's our fault. So completely had they become blinded by sin. Desire of Ages, 28. Here's another one to stir our thinking. What are we after anyway? The Israelites fixed their hopes upon worldly greatness. Why didn't they follow God's way? They thought that by following the world, you know, I've thought sometimes, I think some people have the idea that the way for us to become the head is to do what the world is doing, but do it better than the world. No, God has a totally different plan. And it leads to doing almost everything different from the world. I mean, there's some things we will do that we'll fix our car the same way they have to fix their car. But there are so many things that we will not do like the world. But if we have our sights on worldly greatness, we may make a mistake. They were to become great by looking at God and doing what He asked them to do. And they would rise to greatness. But many are looking at what the world is doing and trying to do that better and become great. And it's working to a certain degree, or they wouldn't do it, you know. It was in vain that God sent them warning by His prophets. Why did God send so many prophets? You know, the writings of Moses were enough. We didn't need any more. That's all we need. If we really studied the writings of Moses, we actually wouldn't even need the New Testament. But God saw that they kept drifting away, so He sent a prophet. And then they drifted away again. He sent another prophet and another prophet, and we keep having it. And finally, He sent Ellen White, because we were drifting also. And so, you know, the prophets are come one after the other to bring us back. In vain, they suffered the chastisement of heathen oppression. Isn't that sad? So they were taken captives, and they still didn't wake up. I believe most of the persecution that God's people suffer comes because of their own sins. It's not because God would let His people suffer that way, but when they get too far off the track, that's the second method that God has to rescue them. His primary way is to give blessings. But when we don't learn from the blessings, then He has to give us trouble. And more people turn to God in trouble than turn to Him while they're blessed. And so that's why trouble comes. I even think in the last days, that's why persecution's coming. It's not because God's people have to have it. It's because we've done so many things that we shouldn't have done, and it's going to come. Every reformation was followed by deeper apostasy. So God would send somebody to bring a reformation. They would get back to God, and then it would slide back worse than even before. Many people will like revival, but actually revival is dangerous, by the way. Yes?
You mentioned persecution, though. The reason persecution comes is the same reason that Cain killed Abel, right?
Yeah, there's the hatred of the wicked against the righteous. Yeah, that's true. But it seems like that God also delivers a lot of times. You know, and the people would come, they want to wipe out Israel, instead they get wiped out. I'm going to preach tomorrow about Jehoshaphat. And, you know, when they got to the battlefield, everybody was dead. Yes.
Yeah, could you just expound more on revival? You said it's good, but it's bad.
It's bad because most people don't keep it. After the revival, they go back. And the problem is that after a revival, you don't go back to where you were, you go lower. So now you're worse off than you were before the revival. So that's why revival is dangerous. Not that we shouldn't want revival, but we need to know that if we get a revival, we got to keep on going. Because if we don't keep going, we're going to be worse off than we were before.
And usually when you backslide from a revival, your heart is hardened and it's more difficult to be revived the next time.
Exactly. That's right. Yes.
When
I know.
But isn't it better to have revival and, because it's not 100% that people go downhill.
Yeah. Well, not everyone goes downhill, but the majority seem to. I think I mentioned this here a few weeks ago, but I wanted to increase prayer meetings, so I preached a sermon, a pretty straight sermon about prayer meeting. The next prayer meeting, I had 50 more people there than what I had before. I said, wow, this is wonderful. But 2 weeks later, it's right back to the same attendance that I always get. See, this is the problem. That we all would like a revival, but a lot of times God doesn't send it because He knows what would happen afterward. But revival is supposed to get us going, and we're to keep on going. So every reformation was followed by deeper apostasy. Had Israel been true to God, He could have accomplished His purpose through their honor and exaltation. See, that's what He wanted to do, but He couldn't do it through the nation. However, the good news is what He couldn't do through the nation, He did through individuals. And that's why we have Esther, we have Daniel, we have Joseph, and He did it through individuals, but He wasn't able to do it through the nation. But because of their unfaithfulness, God's purpose could be wrought out only through continued adversity and humiliation. He finally got to her. It just had to be trouble after trouble after trouble. Even when Jesus came, as you know, oh, how they chafed under the Roman rule, but God couldn't deliver them out of it. In affliction, many renewed their faithfulness to His covenant. Because trouble, we do better in trouble than we do when everything is nice and wonderful. And yet we all long for things to be wonderful, don't we? Well, that's probably as far as we should go for tonight, but that gives you a little taste of these two verses in Deuteronomy, what God had in mind by giving that message to Moses and thus to the Adventist church, and all the rest in between. He wanted that message. And we're still slow learners, but maybe we can be faster learners. We can all see that Jesus' coming is very soon. And so we don't have much time to really get in gear with the plan that He has. And it may be that what many Adventists do will bring persecution upon all of us, even if we didn't do it. But nonetheless, He will use it to purify us and to get us ready for the end. We can carry that easier than we can when everything is really nice.